Kaisha Halberg Edu, Njekwa Mate, Olugbemiga Folabi, and Shadrach Wanjala Nasongo. I had prepared elaborate introductory and concluding speeches, but I was warned that my job is just that of a timekeeper, so I'll keep it that simple and ask us to go just according to the order in which the speakers have been listed. I'll give each speaker 14 minutes. All of them will present, and then we'll have questions and discussions at the end. So, Mr. Folabi, you have the floor. 14 minutes.
Good morning, everyone. My presentation is on comparative political science knowledge and the quality of political institutions in Africa, of the Department of Politics, University of Johannesburg in South Africa, as well as Obafemi Awolowo University, Nigeria. The introduction goes that African universities have a high number of departments that offer political science as a course or program. And as a body of knowledge, the discipline which took off with the establishment of universities during the colonial administration has transited from its colonial heritage to reflect changes that have been wrought in politics and society, especially in the fights for independence and later for democracy. Of course, most of us will recollect that a number of African countries underwent military rule. So how far these changes that have been wrought in politics and society has been a subject of debate. But changes in the discipline has not been uniform, it has not been unidirectional, and has not been holistic. And lastly, to what extent are political science databases, data sets used? These forms are what the study set out to unravel. And so we started looking at this by having a look at political science as a body of knowledge, the assumptions and the realities. We should know that the study of political science as a course of study started in South Africa. It's over a century now, much earlier than the rest of Africa. And that the influence of the struggle for independence and the fate of new states were part of the curriculum and pedagogy. Political science departments were established as separate disciplines. Some places it started as political economy, some places started as political studies, in some places it's just called political administration. Started as a separate discipline, and the courses that were taught was to equip the students with certain skills to influence various aspects of public policy. Therefore, political science as a body of knowledge was accorded as at immediately after post-independence, a place of honor and influence. However, this proposition of honor did not materialize over time for two reasons. One is that the first has to do with the misconception that political science as a course leads to a career in politics, or in local parlance, it involves a training to become a politician. There's this misconception from the interviews we conducted. This in Africa has led to the mischaracterization of what the discipline as a body of knowledge should and can do. The second misconception that has to do with the training of the teachers of the course. With most of the teachers trained to see the discipline in descriptive terms, there's little recourse to quantification, replication, and validity of findings. You don't forget that most of our teachers, of course, had their education in the West, and that is replicated in most of the students they also taught. And so it was largely descriptive that was passed from the old generation to the new generation. With most of the teachers trained to see the discipline in descriptive terms, there's little recourse, like I said, to quantification, replication, and validity of findings. And therefore, we have different ownership structure of what political science should look like. It is debatable that the descriptive nature of the discipline has changed till now, except in South Africa. In South Africa is where we have seen there have been a lot of movement towards quantification. So the political science as assumptions still continue, that it is noteworthy that the teaching of the discipline in Africa has been normative, reflecting the colonial orientation, exposure, and the post-independent struggle for democracy. In other words, the methodological approach was and is still utopian, traditional, and historical. It was less concerned with science and quantification, especially with using the quantification methodology to explain and predict political happenings. Even when behavioral approach was introduced into the discipline, it has not permitted the discipline as expected. Resistance to quantification and the use of data was fierce and is still fierce due to continued training received from those who were originally trained in the normative, traditional, and descriptive nature of political science. This, it must be noted, is divorced from the larger body of political science knowledge in the world, whose emphasis is on quantification of political phenomena to explain political realities. If you look at the works of Schindler and Modu in 2008, you look at the works of Bradley, Collier, and the rest, you see, even the works of John Gehrig, you would see emphasis on political methodology as a sub-discipline now in political science. But this is not reflected in Africa. The seeming resistance to quantification and contradiction in political science teaching and research in African universities is based on two streams of thought on what the discipline should be like in the continent. The first stream is based on the argument that discipline should focus on description and direct application of political science knowledge. The second stream is based on the argument that scientific method is more appropriate in view of modern world and therefore deserving more emphasis than the normative descriptive approach. If you look at the arguments of Ali, you look at the arguments of Ake, you find evidence of this, of the insistence on the descriptive method. So the research design, what design did we use? The study used a two-phase survey. The first is an in-depth interview of colleagues, particularly in the heads of the Department of Political Science, political studies, because in Zambia it's political studies. In some places also in South Africa, most of the Southern Africa is political studies. So in our slide we put this political science / political studies program. And we also interviewed two other lecturers in South Africa, University of Johannesburg, Obafemi Awolowo University in Nigeria, and University of Zambia, Lusaka. The second is the quantitative examination of the publication outputs of lecturers in the three departments to determine the extent of the use or non-use of the data sets in their research works, and in particular the databases of Afrobarometer, Varieties of Democracy, and Mo Ibrahim. We sent letters initially to the three organizations to give us access to their database so that we can see the frequency, the number of African scholars that have used their database to publish. But this was not forthcoming as at the time this work was prepared. So that's why we used the research outputs of lecturers in the three universities who are our colleagues. The responses to both the quantitative and qualitative survey satisfy the standards of quantitative and qualitative survey research, and thus provide the basis for a credible assessment of the discipline in selected African countries. Very quickly, surveying the field research and discussion. When we look at the results, we discover that over 85% over 58.5 are non-users of this database. Less than 41.5% uses this database, whether Afrobarometer or Mo Ibrahim or what have you. In fact, at a point, Mo Ibrahim put it out that those who use their database will be paid just to encourage people to patronize the database. We also look at the level of usage. It was discovered that it was very low at Zambia and in AAU, but very high or much higher in Johannesburg. We also look at the awareness. We discovered that virtually all lecturers are aware of these databases, of all these data sets, only that the usage is much more lower than expected. And then we also look at a composite analysis of the country or the countries of the level of awareness and usage. Also, again, South Africa comes tops. Again, this speaks basically to the level of knowledge or the level of exposure of the South African political scientists compared to their, other African counterparts. And we'll do more analysis as we go on. Very quickly, we now look at what are this quantification and the challenges of political science. What are the issues? The first is the challenge of training. Many political scientists who were interviewed said we are not trained in quantification. They are not trained in quantification, and therefore they are not particularly proficient in mathematics and statistics. This is the number one drawback. Of course, the training is the number two. The second challenge has to do with the dwindling academic staff meant to cope with the joining number of students in political science department. In post-apartheid South Africa, the number increased. After independence, the number increased. The number of students that were admitted at both undergraduate and postgraduate levels increased. And of course, the staff level did not increase at commensurate level. And so there were little time for training, retraining, and further skill acquisition. The third has to do with challenge of funding. Incidentally, Professor Victor mentioned about Codestra. Some of us have benefited from Codestra to research methodology, scholarly writing, and so many other avenues. And so you discover that most of our colleagues don't have the funding. The university doesn't provide funding for staff development. In fact, as we speak, in University of Zambia, salaries are being held. And so you have all kinds of issues with funding. And so we'll also look very quickly at political science and the quality of political institutions. And our take is that without the use of these data sets, without the use of political methodology in terms of quantification, it has robbed our political institutions of the facts and figure for them to function effectively. In fact, what we have across these three countries, in most cases, are political institutions that are dysfunctional. And so, we believe, in conclusion, that we need to look at three key issues quickly before I round up. Are we going to look at it in terms of renaissance? Are we going to look at it in terms of revolution? Or are we going to look at it in terms of reversion? The choice is us if we want to look at the future of political science. Are we just going to, we want to have a new revolution? The trend now in the body of political science, especially in Europe and in North America, is towards quantification. Is Africa going to remain where it is in terms of largely utopian descriptive methodology, or are we going to also adapt to the current realities? Of course, we must also say before I round up that critical engagement with quantification within discipline is necessary, while not neglecting the philosophical basis of most of these concepts. Taking a little further, the presence of philosophical inquiry in political science methodology is not an abnormality signifying subjectivity, but rather a well-nuanced approach that combines the empirical research that produces outputs that can produce outputs with mathematical results that are testable, explanatory, and replicable. Such research production is what Africa political science needs. Thank you.
Okay, and I'm having some problems with my voice, but I'll sit over there so I can control my PowerPoint. So my name is Kaisa Holberg-Edu, and I'm working with Professor Lisa Laxo on the project that brought you here to this conference. And I wanted to thank Lisa and Godwin for their determination to also include younger scholars in this discussion. I'm one of the people who are benefiting from that strong determination, and I hope to not disappoint. My background is I've just joined Lisa's project after working as a lecturer at a private university here in Ghana, Ashesi University, as a political science and liberal arts lecturer broadly. So I'm excited to be a full-time researcher, and the paper I'm presenting to you today is kind of a development of a project I started a couple of years ago focusing on data on higher education in Ghana, but it made me kind of zoom out a little bit and look at what data is available for the continent as a whole. And then for our project, I'm starting to look at what data is available for political science. So I'm going to focus on indicators, resources, and ownership. My theoretical background is as a decolonial scholar trained at University of Ghana. And I'm interested in knowledge as very central to development. And especially Grossvogel's ideas on how knowledge is important both in colonizing and decolonizing situations, and Ndlovu Gatsheni from South Africa, and his more pointed writings on decolonizing the university. So there's too much text on this little slide, but I wanted to just add to kind of a general understanding of maybe contradictory university functions posted by Castell. They're all supposed to lead to development, but maybe they also need to be decolonized of sorts. And I think data is not, data on higher education is not taken away from that. Some examples, just to sketch for you what data is openly available to us on higher education. You would have things like percentage of youth enrolled in higher education, so some kind of gross enrollment rate. Currently for sub-Saharan Africa is at 8%, and this is data from the UNESCO Institute of Statistics. And they have, of course, broken this down into countries. You have 16% for Ghana last 2 years, 22% for South Africa, so it's the 8% is also masking the huge diversity, and they like to show these very aggregated data easily available, and then breaking it down, you have to work a little bit for it. Then we have a table, sorry, you can see, but it's from Cloete and et al., 2015. That is the Herana project with the Center for Higher Education Transformation, and I'll get back to that a little bit. But here you see, for instance, a table for South Africa, where we have broken down first years. 1995 is at the bottom and 2012 at the top. Average shares of doctoral enrollments in the various fields of study. And this type of data, I think, is really important and interesting. Here we can, for instance, see that humanities and social sciences, which is the kind of, it's a gray on my screen, but white for you, has, with time, become smaller, starting at 41% in 1995 and 30% today. Maybe in absolute numbers, though, that has actually grown because enrollments have also grown. But this type of data is very difficult to get for other countries than South Africa, in my, according to the research I have done. So you have the very aggregate enrollment type data. UNESCO Institute of Statistics, for instance, also shares information on education system, participation in education, progress and completion, expenditures, literacy rates, expenditure on R&D, but not beyond that. We can't get disaggregated data in the type that we have for South Africa. So I wanted to talk about what stakeholders are involved in collecting data on higher education, and it starts from the bottom The local level, of course, universities all collect data on what they do. They do not often make it easy to access that data. I realized when I was doing research for Ghana. For University of Ghana at the time, I would have to walk to the public affairs office and ask for a printed copy of the data. I know with time it's become a little bit more available online, but still it's difficult to, if you're further away, to access the data. But data is sent, for instance, to the local government agency in Ghana is the National Council for Tertiary Education that puts data together. It's not often available publicly again. Last year I found out that the institutions that report data, so the universities themselves, will get a CD-ROM in return with other institutions' data. But if you're not then working at those institutions, or I was, but I was not in a leadership position, so I would not have access to it. So I think the open data issue is another thing I'll get back to. I also put the political science associations there, represented by the Nigerian one. I've been starting to look at their websites. I'm not finding much data though, but I definitely think they should be a stakeholder. You have platforms such as Open Africa that collects data sets openly, and they have quite a lot on basic education. AAU, our host a very nice database of African theses and dissertations, and I think this is an excellent initiative that shows what we can do. However, we don't have analysis of this database. Well, what are the trends? What are people writing more about or less about over time? AAU used to be involved in the Guide to Higher Education in Africa, published with Palgrave Macmillan, but I believe the latest edition was in 2013. There they would list kind of the members of the association. The International Association of Universities still produce a similar publication, but for all universities in the world, the World Education Database. What is it called? The World Higher Education Database. But that one is also either you get it in print and you pay for it, or you have to also pay to access that data. The World Bank, of course, collects data on education, and I think it's interesting when we have migrated into the Sustainable Development Goals that there is now a goal on tertiary education, goal 4.4. So maybe there will be more data collected on higher education also by the big wigs. And I've talked about UNESCO already. So to summarize some of the unknowns, flow-through rates, we don't know much about that. Where do students get stuck? My own experience as a PhD scholar in University of Ghana was that 1 year the fees were up by 80%. That was a year some of my peers did not come back. So I think that's an important thing, thank you. We have discipline mix over time outside South Africa, which has good data. Regional comparative data, for example, on fees, would be very interesting to have. Student-teacher ratios, but also graduate employment or maybe underemployment. What happens to our graduates afterwards? Content, we don't know much about what we mean by political science, but we'll learn more in the panelists by the panelists after me. And then, as I said, we could do more with the student thesis databases that we now have. So for political science, we actually cannot say how many students we have in political science on the continent. We cannot say how many we graduate. We don't know what content our courses have, and what we do research about, and how much research we do, because it's not broken down by discipline. Where our graduates go to work, Do they go to the public, private sector? If they migrate to a larger or lesser extent, would be interesting to know, especially when we talk about impact. So now I don't have so much time, but I just wanted to kind of give some maybe recommendations from what I've seen in terms of indicators that they need to be relevant, comparable, of course frequently compiled and updated. This can be done with benchmarking, learning from each other. The Hirana project I spoke about that started in 2007 was a Ford Foundation grant initially, followed 7 research universities over time. Indeed. Does it mean my time is up? And the Hirana project developed 26 indicators that I think are interesting and that could be developed for the continent. There's also education management information systems that collected data on lower levels for the whole continent of Africa that could be expanded for higher education. Of course, you need capacity to collect data, update and publish data. And data management is also not for free, but maybe the most important resource is knowledge on the direction. Several scholars who write about this talk about a vision for higher education as very important for collecting data, because otherwise you don't know what data is important to you. For instance, do we want to also look at diversification of higher educational institutions, see maybe what strengths different universities have, what strengths different political science departments have. And then in terms of ownership, we can both say from citizen point of view that education is a major budget post for most African countries, R&D much less so. Still, value for tax money is key. What output do we get for this data should be openly available. We need also, I think we spoke a little bit earlier, leverage to collect data. Do we have to, how do we get universities to participate and to share their data? We could do that in rankings, for instance, the different models, but the ranking model, universities are keen to be ranked well. So that seems to be working quite well. But we also need multi-stakeholder involvement. So I want to conclude. Data on higher education for Africa is either quite local, national, often not really comparable over regions, or not aggregated, or often then not openly available. Or the international data available is highly aggregated and kind of too general for us, for instance, in this room. The discipline-specific data especially is in much lacking, but thesis databases I think is a positive, rich resource that we could do more with. And as you have seen, a wide range of stakeholders collect and publish data. But data on content, we don't really have a database for for syllabi, for instance, which would be interesting. And societal impact of higher education is missing. So I think my voice has come to an end. It lasted exactly 15 minutes or 14. Thank you so much for your attention.
Good morning. My name's Ehouan from the University of Zambia, Department of Political and Administrative Studies. I'm also the regional manager for the Varieties of Democracy project for Southern Africa. So my presentation is on the impact of political science research on teaching political science in Africa. Maybe I was too ambitious, because after trying to gather information, I only ended up with more information on Southern Africa than other regions. So perhaps the final paper will focus on Southern Africa. So the structure is as follows. There's an introduction, methodology, then I'll look at political science and democracy databases. There are quite a number of them. Then we'll look at the use of databases in teaching at various universities in Southern Africa, and the use of databases by students. Then we'll move on to focus on the contributions and impact of these databases. Then we'll look at the availability of infrastructure and capacities at the various universities where I got information from. Then I'll conclude and provide recommendations. So many academic and research institutes, next slide, have produced empirical data on political science research, on democracy, on governance over the 100 years in almost all the countries in the world. But at the core of all this research is that we should generate knowledge and disseminate it. Knowledge regarding the political science discipline, knowledge regarding democracy, the democratization process in Africa, and also knowledge regarding governance in the world and in Africa. In most African countries, the development of the universities and research has been firmly tied to the vagaries of state politics and policies, and the shifting missions and mandates of international donor agencies, and the unpredictable demands and dislocations of civil society, the civil society sector. However, in Africa, we also have challenges, and these include the cultures of universities themselves. They've been changing over time. And in my own university, in fact, or Zambia in particular, we have even seen a change in the way government is now viewing how they should run public universities. So increasingly politicians are saying universities should fund themselves. So the logic is changing. So, and you have seen also policymakers adopting this view, and it has filtered through to technocrats. So we are facing challenges of funding, and with challenges of funding, it's difficult to teach, it's difficult to do research, and many other activities that universities should do. So there are also challenges regarding the goals and governance of research institutions and universities. There are also challenges regarding the management of resources, infrastructures, and their capacities to pursue intellectual excellence and equity. There is also the issue of political autonomy and public accountability. In Africa, we have seen also that public universities nowadays don't seem to be autonomous from the governments or from politics. Increasingly, government is interfering in the operations of universities. I can speak for my own universities. We have seen academics being controlled not only in terms of how the institution should be funded, but also in terms of what programs will be sponsored for the students who are coming in, and also in terms of what kind of research the government funds and so on and so forth. And we have also seen that government increasingly, for public universities, they are moving away from funding public universities. And there's absolutely, like in my country, there's absolutely no funding for research from the government. You have to source your own funds for research. So the methodology, I did a literature review, document review, administered some questionnaires to colleagues at my university and another public university just north of Lusaka, because in Zambia we only have 2 universities that teach political science. Also emailed some questions to some colleagues in Malawi. I had some responses in Malawi, responses from Mozambique. There were no responses from Botswana, no responses from Zimbabwe, no responses from Namibia. Of course, South Africa is at a different level. They always respond to requests for information. There were no responses from Tanzania and so on. So you can see that the response rate was quite low. I also did some key informants interviews with some colleagues in Zambia and Malawi. So there are various political science databases. We know of Polity4, which gathers information from 195 countries from 1800 to date or present. Then there's Adam Proziski and others. Freedom House, which gathers information from 195 countries, but from 1973 to date or present. The Van Ehouan Index of Democratization, Jose Shebab type of regime, gathering information from 1945 to 2000. I don't know whether I'm correct on that. The Economist, sorry, there's a mistake. The Economist Intelligence Unit, Democracy Index, which gathers information from 167 countries since 2006. Then there's the Ibrahim Index of African Governance, which gathers information from 54 countries from 2007 to date. But you should note that for this index, they usually update information. So for 2018, they're updating the information. If they update the information, then they delete like the previous round. So you have always to rely on the latest. Yeah, then there's Afrobarometer, which gathers information from 37 countries in Africa. And since 1999, Afrobarometer has conducted 6 surveys. Varieties of Democracy gathers information from 1900 to date or present, focusing on 202 countries. And from 2015, when VDEM started releasing databases, they have so far reached version 9. Version 10, the version 10 dataset for VDEM will be out probably first quarter of 2020. Then there's Global Integrity, focusing on 54 countries since 2013. Quality of Government, focusing on data from 1946 to date or present. And in fact, the American Political Science Association has regarded quality of government, the Quality of Government Index, as one of the best. I think they won an award at an APSA conference sometime back. Then there's World Bank Governance Indicators, focusing on 200 countries from 1996, and so on and so forth. So those are just some of the databases. There are obviously some more databases. Then I'll move on, next slide. The use of databases in teaching. Just from the presentation by Dr. Afolabi, the usage obviously is low, with an exception of South Africa. The usage in most of it at the University of Zambia is low, at the University of Malawi is low, and also in Mozambique, and so on and so forth. So these databases aid the delivery of courses, such as research methods, according to the responses I got from the people I talked to. They say the databases help them in delivery of courses such as research methods, comparative politics, democracy, democratization, and governance. And in terms of helps lecturers and students to move away from relying on books and articles alone, they begin to interact with datasets to have a practical and evidence-based analysis of political developments in Africa and beyond. However, most of the course modules at Southern African universities, with the exception of South Africa, are not fully using this data because the faculty members haven't interacted so much with these databases. It's far much easier, for example, to just, if you're teaching, for example, comparative politics, to just look at the different party systems in different countries than looking at a detailed analysis of what the data sets are telling you. and so on and so forth. So you can see that the academia uses more qualitative methods, or at my university, they call it use of qualitative methods, but at the end of the day, it's just too much focus on document reviews. So at most universities, sources of cutting-edge research information are somewhat limited. So the databases can make it possible to get supplementary teaching information from all such databases. VDEM provides an example of latest research information that is regularly shared world over. The datasets can be downloaded. Afrobarometer also data is available and it can be downloaded. And in fact, for Africa, Afrobarometer is the most used database. Even for Zambian scholars, Afrobarometer is the most used databases. Even for the Malawian scholars, they told me that they use Afrobarometer data more than anything else. This is perhaps simply because Afrobarometer has been training scholars from African universities. Still do that now. I know also Kodesia does that. The Mo Ibrahim Foundation also provides regular updates. Use of databases by students. Students in research methods often use this data and comparative politics, but the usage is more by master's and PhD students than undergraduate students. There are not as many students using this because of insufficient grounding on how to do data analysis, especially analysis of a quantitative nature. So they need to use these databases, cause for students to use the internet, and this is a challenge in some African universities, as opposed to the reliance on textbooks. So traditional sources of information, such as textbooks, are still being used side by side with databases, but perhaps more. So it helps students have a more current empirical data that they can analyze themselves. And these databases enriches the theoretical basis in class lessons and discussions. Has teaching changed? It hasn't changed much. Although we have noted that teaching would be more theoretical in the absence of such databases. And these databases enable students to have hands-on experience in research courses, and so on and so forth. They also enlighten students on the political developments in the continent and beyond. If they want to understand or grasp what is happening regarding democracy, governance, and so on and so forth, they need to refer to these democracy and governance indices so that they can compare various countries in terms of how they are faring on the democracy index or governance index. So teaching has not significantly changed because the use of this data is still limited, as Afolabi has, Dr. Afolabi has said. Okay, 1 minute. So the availability of these databases has opened up possibilities of cross-country analysis. And sometimes politicians react to research findings, positively or negatively. And policymakers cite such findings, which can be used as a proxy to measure the impact of these data sets or databases. In addition, these databases, the databases that are generated through public surveys, indirectly shape the decisions of political leaders, as well as how they worry about the votes they'll get in the next election. The other proxy that can be used to measure the impact of these data sets or databases is to look at the downloads, dissertations, theses, publications, and policy briefs that have been produced by African scholars. I don't have much information on this, but perhaps the final version, I'll be able to analyze the number of downloads. What these databases do, and do very well, is that they tell the story of the phenomenon as they evolve. So in that way, those who use the databases are kept abreast of these developments. So I can skip that slide. Let me skip some slide. So the availability of, we look at the availability of infrastructure and capacities. So both infrastructure and capacities remain a challenge. There could be many reasons. Lecturers interested in the use of this data are few, as Dr. Afolabi said. And also there is lack of use of statistical software. The next slide. Such as SPSS, Stata, NVivo, Atlas TI, and so on and so forth. So universities in Southern Africa, with an exception of South Africa, are facing challenges regarding infrastructure. However, the ARA software is free. So it can easily be downloaded and students can interact with it and so on and so forth. Conclusion, the use of databases in some universities is low. Afrobarometer is the most widely used, although there's also an increase in the terms of the use of other databases like VDEM, the Ibrahim Indicator of African Governance, Polity, and so on and so forth. Then a few recommendations. This is the last slide. Yeah, sorry. There is great need to build capacity in the use by universities of databases for academic work. Then regional, national, and continental political science associations need to take up this challenge. Political science disciplines in Africa need to collaborate more because currently there is very little collaboration. And lastly, research institutions need to run summer or winter schools, perhaps focusing on the model by Afrobarometer or Codesha. Thank you.
Oh, good morning, everyone. Yeah, my name is Nasongo. I teach international studies at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee. And my presentation this morning is on mapping the theoretical and conceptual terrain of the political science study of Africa. And in terms of the premise, I proceed from the idea that the main focus of political science research on Africa has been the problematic of development. And yet this problematic of development, or the process of development, has proceeded within a context of political, economic, and social oppression. And therefore you have two trajectories in terms of political science study of Africa. Whereas political science research that focuses on the problematic of development has given epistemological priority to generation of empirical political knowledge, the research emphasis on the problematic of emancipation from oppression and exploitation prioritizes an epistemological conception of knowledge that facilitates radical change because of the kind of questions that this approach raises. Now, in terms of how I proceed, number one, the purpose of my paper is to explore the nexus between the research that focuses on development and the research that focuses on emancipation, and how effective the production of knowledge via these approaches has been. I proceed by dividing the paper into three major sections. And the argument is that the relevance and implications of political science epistemologies generated by normative knowledge tends to be much more profound in terms of its transformational capacity, while the epistemologies generated by research that focuses mainly using empirical and positivist approaches produces knowledge that tends to be pro status quo. That is the argument that I make in my paper. And so I begin first by mapping out theoretical approaches that have knowingly been liberal in their approach. The first one, of course, is the modernization theory, started in the 1960s through the 1970s. I'm sure this is an approach that many of us are aware of. It is path-dependent with economic, social, and political trajectories drawing from approaches from other disciplines. Now, the main argument of this approach is that all societies go through, of course, the same stages of development, and that African societies were expected to go through the same. All right? It really justified considerable increase in the allocation of governmental funds to social scientists, especially those working on development issues. And but what I find problematic about it is that it's based on the experience of Western countries, the experiences of Western countries and extrapolation of those experiences to African countries, which may be dismissed as being an anatomistic fallacy. Number two, the second were political order approaches that emerged in the the 1970s through the early 1980s. Now, this resulted from the fact that the expectations of modernization theory did not come to pass. All right, three major developments. Number one was the increase in insurgency movements on the continent. Number two was the level of military coups on the continent. And then number three was an external factor that was US-based in terms of the civil rights movement in the US and protests against US involvement in Vietnam that led to a shift in focus from modernization on the part of Africa and elsewhere to issues of political order and stability. And so political science studies on the continent also started focusing on issues of political order, arguing that the process of modernization, in fact, does not necessarily lead to democracy, but it may lead to issues of political decay. In fact, 8 major crises were noted as a result of the process of development. 8 major crises, right? The crisis of identity, of legitimacy, of participation, of penetration, distribution, integration, national survival, and the crisis of external control. And so the prescription from the perspective of political order approaches was that you need political institutionalization. The logic was that, in fact, it is not the form of government that matters, but it is the degree of government. Now, the result of this, the knowledge generated from this, had the effect, in fact, of legitimizing authoritarianism in Africa and giving a lot of logic and philosophical support to the establishment of authoritarian regimes. Number three, within the liberal paradigm, were public policy process approaches, late 1970s through the 1980s. Now, this was born out of the critique of the theories that were being used then, that that political scientists were engaging in what was called grand theorizing, that you need to come down to the nitty-gritty of public policy making. And this is what led to the rise of this process that had 2 trajectories, the political economy approach and the public policy process. One focused on the idea of identifying the right policies for implementation on the part of Africa, the other one focusing on the impact and implications of the policies being adopted on the continent. And this impetus for the shift toward public policy perspectives was in fact an increasing emphasis on the role of the state in Africa, leading especially on the African continent on the rise of a lot of scholarship on what was being called Africa's lost decades. Number 4, this comes from the mid-1990s through the 2010s, the contemporary period, the current period that we are in, which I notice is characterized by a liberal theoretical eclecticism, focusing on a myriad of themes from democratization to the role of ethnicity and conflict, to centering gender in the approach to the study of Africa, to the analysis of worst case scenarios of state collapse in Somalia, in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, and so on, and to focusing on the individual African political leaders and what they have done on the continent. Then number 3, or the third, are the critical approaches, all right, which I identify first as the dependency theory, which emerged in the late 1960s through the early 1970s with the writings of the likes of Gunda Frank, Rodney, Cardoso, Samir Amin, also Kamin. And the basic argument here being that the African continent was introduced to the world capitalist system from an unequal footing, and that the relations between the global north and the global south are essentially exploitative, and that they are structured to remain so forevermore until kingdom come. This was the basis of the dependence theory. And that this is as a result of the harmony of interests between what was called the center of the center and the center of the periphery. That the political class in Africa and the political and economic class in the developed world have a harmony of interests. And those interests are not consonant with the interests of the general populations on the African continent. And that this then explains why, in spite of the fact that that partnership is deleterious to the general interest of the majority of the people, it continues because it's a partnership between our political class here and the political elite from elsewhere. Then you have the world systems theory that emerged in the mid-1970s through the 1980s, which introduced a different, it's rooted in the dependence thing, but it introduced a third aspect to it. So the dependence school is dyadic, the division of the world into the center and the periphery. The world systems approach introduced what it called a semi-periphery, which then functions to kind of alleviate the perception of the division, the stark division between the core and the periphery. So you have semi-peripheries which are neither in the periphery nor are they in the core. So you have regional powers, Nigeria in West Africa, South Africa in the Southern African region, perhaps Kenya, right, in Eastern African region, which are seen to be developing, all right? And so the basic argument of the dependency theory was that you needed polarization of the relations between the periphery and the center. But the existence of the semi-periphery then blunts that kind of polarization, and therefore change will never come to pass. Then you had neo-Marxism as well. You had new critical research trends in the current system, for a critical review of the process of democratization, political economy approach, neo-imperialism, post-imperialism, and so on. The idea of engendering the social sciences, the study of social movements, but the most important in the critical tradition is the African nationalist school, which has focused on the notion that we need research on Africa by African scholars, and they need to generate networks within the continent that are capable of articulating the kind of research and recommendations that reflect the lived experience of African peoples. And this, I think, has been an effective leadership on the part of Codesria. Much of the scholarship generated within that has been within the critical tradition and focused on issues of African development. Finally, I have to have a say about the dialectic approach, which I find only one scholar has engaged in the use of the dialectics in this political study of Africa. And this is Professor Ali Mazrui. very effective in analyzing issues from a dialectical perspective. Now, there are three laws of the dialectics. The law of the unity and the conflict of opposites, the law of the passage of quantitative change into qualitative change, and the law of the negation of the negation. Of these three laws, Mazurui has tended to apply the first one, the law of the unity and the conflict of opposites, in his analysis of the African social political situation. For example, back in 1966, he wrote a paper on Nkrumah as the Leninist Tsar, arguing that Nkrumah strove to be Africa's Lenin, a revolutionary theorist, while at the same time he sought to be Ghana's Tsar, an imperial ruler. A very effective way of analyzing things. That his strategy was, Nkrumah's tragedy was a tragedy of excess rather than of contradiction, that he tried to be too much of a revolutionary monarch. Here is another one. He argues that Africa is an Eden of lost innocence, while America is the Eden of current power and future fulfillment. Here he was focusing on the issue of how important a role Africa has played in the development of the US. And yet the US has more or less neglected Africa, and that both are actually Edens. The Eden of lost innocence, the Eden of fulfillment. Look, with regard to Nigeria and South Africa, he applies the same dialectical approach, arguing that Nigeria is the Africa of human resources, South Africa of mineral resources. Nigeria, repellent to European settlement, South Africa, a magnet of the same. Nigeria, monoracial society, South Africa, multiracial one. Nigeria, grappling with the politics of religion, South Africa, preoccupied with the politics of secularism. Nigeria, the largest exporter of oil, South Africa, the continent's largest consumer of oil, and on and on. Look, the idea that pan movements are born out of dream and nightmare, out of anguish and vision. This dialectical thing, the unity of opposites. And actually it's reflected in the natural phenomena. All natural things are said to be composed of a unity of opposites. If you look at physics, electricity, you have negative and positive electricity. You boil water, you freeze. In mechanics, you have the law of what? Action and reaction. In mathematics, you have the integral and you have the... I'm told my time is out. So let me conclude by again also pointing out that within the discipline of political science, it has been also at some times a discipline at war with each other. There is contestation between which methodologies are better, which ones are worse. So you have the one that focuses on empiricism, positivist orientation, arguing that we should, as political scientists, only focus on things that we can measure, things that we can see, things that are tangible, while others argue that we need to also focus on things that we feel. And in fact, that there is no objective reality out there. Everything is interpretation, the notion of narrativizing reality. And so these ones argues these ones that if you cannot measure it, your knowledge is meager and unsatisfactory. These ones accuse these ones of being too conservative and invested in the status quo. And that the thing is not just to study reality and explain it, but it is much more important to change it. Let me finish by making one statement, that again also political science has been a victim of oppression and dismissal by the powers that be. For a long time, political scientists have been tormented. They have been chased around. They have ended up in exile. In Kenya, where I come from, the political science department had to change name in order to survive. So political scientists have suffered. And that is why perhaps we have the crisis that we are talking about. Thank you for listening to me.
Okay. I think our presenters deserve another round of applause. Thank you very much. I think I'll open it up for questions. I don't know if there is someone to pass around the microphone. I'll try to take names. Someone to help with the microphone on the floor. Listening to our speakers, I think generally we can say that political science in Africa is not in a very healthy state, except in South Africa. I look forward to this conversation with Cheryl Hendricks. Please make your questions brief and your comments brief as well. We'll take a first round. We'll see how it goes, and then maybe we might take another round. Yes, please introduce yourself as well.
My name is Chambi Chachage from Tanzania. My first question is for Afolabi and Mate. In my observation, it seems that you are putting a lot of emphasis on quantification in political science. And from my understanding, we do have some sort of quantitative studies in a number of African countries. But to me, it seems the emphasis on quantification is a particular type of quantification that has been headed in the US, especially in the attempt of political science to almost be like economics, where you're having a lot of economic regressions, a lot of like hypothesis testing, which are almost make political science appear as if it's economics. So could you elaborate, what do you really mean? Are you trying to make political science in Africa be like the one in the US? Or you are trying to promote what is already there? Because all this data, Afrobarometer data, people are using them, but they just don't do those kind of regression analysis that are done in the US and probably in South Africa. And my last question is for Nasongo. I really like the trends that you've showed, but in my observation, I'm also seeing a lot of like some of the trends that seems to be there or dominant in the 70s or 60s. They are always there up to now, like in some sort of a movement of contestation. So, for instance, if you look at people like Samiri Amin or the wealth systems theory, yes, some people have discredited them, but there was some sort of an attempt to make sure that they are continuing. So could you elaborate more on that? Thank you.
Is it my turn? Yes. Okay, thank you very much. I think I will just key into what the last speaker has said. A short story, Mr. Chair. I was a beneficiary, so to speak, of the Afrobarometer training in Cape Town. And of course, that was when I was representing Afrobarometer in Nigeria. Fantastic effort, and it's still working well. But let me tell you what happened one of those trainings. And I had the privilege of interacting with a number of graduate students, PhD students from Southern Africa. And after 2 weeks of training, Michael Bratton was there, Peter Lewis was there, Gima was to join us. I now asked one of the professors from the West that, look, we've been here and we've not heard the name of Mamdani, we've not heard Klodaki, we've not heard Shiji. Could it be that this is another brand of method of teaching the reality in the African political environment? And you know the response I got. Incidentally, last week I reminded the author of that reference. The reference was that, you see, what exactly are you talking about, the work of Mandani? I said, let's take citizen and subject. And I got the response, you know, that work was not based on empirical data. It was a live discussion between me and that person, said, not based on, and I said, come again. So historical data does not constitute empirical data. What are we saying? I think there are a lot of confusion that is going on, and which make this kind of platform very necessary. I do subscribe to the use of quantification, and indeed about 15 years ago, I drew the attention of Social Science Academy in Nigeria to the need for quantification and the need for us to do some thorough training, not necessarily putting it above every other method, but in a way we can engage, so that when we are suffocated with disjointed empiricism, we can also respond. And there is a sense in which we need to also be careful that, look, it is possible through descriptive analysis to still present the realities in a way that we can, and on the basis of that, make projection and prediction. Who says theories don't come from philosophizing? Theory as a body of knowledge helps us to explain better and to see better. I think one of the challenges that we do have, I do agree with the shying away from quantification. It has to do with very unstable philosophic foundation. The theory is no longer emphasized in the foundation courses. And I think the response I want from the panel is, what can we do to bring back the theory, to bring back philosophizing into teaching and research on political science? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the presentations and also for the questions, because my question somehow relates perfectly to what you have been saying. So I see, first of all, I agree that African universities kind of have a disadvantage in terms of internet access, statistical programs, so it becomes difficult to teach methods when you don't have that access. But I think that we should not fall back into this qualitative or qualitative is better debate. So I think methods are tools, and we all benefit from understanding them. So when the Afrobarometer teaches quantitative methods, use them as what they are, quantitative methods to answer certain kinds of questions. And I think that I met a lot of African students who are quite interested in learning it. You don't need to use it, but when you understand it, you can also criticize it and say, okay, I don't want to use it, I use different types of analysis, and I also don't agree that qualitative analysis is only document analysis or philosophy. There are a lot of advanced qualitative methods, and I think the question should not be what is better, do we need more of this or more of that, but the question should be, how can we advance the skills of African students to make use of the full range of methods that are available? And I think things like teaching methods courses or something would be a great idea, and maybe having more exchange between Europe and Africa in that regard would also be a great idea. But I would like to ask a question. When you said that maybe the skills are lacking, or many political science lecturers are not making use of the data because they don't have the skills, what about collaborations between departments in their own universities? Because I guess that the economics department will have some statistical packages, will have some people who have the knowledge that they could transfer, and there are also free statistical packages like R that you can use completely free. So what about linking political science and other departments where it is interesting and necessary? For example, also with philosophy, but sociology, also economics, to make use of the full range of methods and skills that are already there in your university. So that would be my question.
Good morning. My name is Gretchen Bauer. I'm from the University of Delaware in the USA, but I'm currently a MIASA Fellow at the University of Ghana, Legon. And I wanted to bring together some of the opening remarks and then some of the things that Kaisa said. So I was a little surprised to hear about the African Association of Political Science and how it's defunct, apparently, according to what was said at the beginning of the morning. And so when Kaisa was talking about all that data about political science programs, political science majors, et cetera, I don't know, is there someone here from the American Political Science Association? Okay, so I believe that in the US, you know, it's the APSA that gathers a lot of that data and publishes a lot of that data. And so again, you see the lack of that institution, the African Association of Political Science, on the continent, in that a lot of that data is not being collected and made available. Another thing I wanted to mention, and again, these are comments, not questions really. In the US, you know, it's really the Americanists who are more likely to be using quantitative research methodologies than others. Although, you know, increasingly what one sees is the use of mixed methods, right? So using both approaches. And I think it's really important that when we're having these conversations, so this is some of what Anya said, I mean, you know, data is not only numbers, right? Data is not only used by, you know, scholars who use quantitative methods. So we need to keep that in mind as well. And then just the last thing, again, kind of echoing what Anya said, you know, we send our students to research methods workshops, right? I mean, they're held at different universities around the country. And so, you know, there really has to be a focus on research methods and data gathering and so on and so forth. But maybe, you know, those institutions across the African continent that can offer those kinds of workshops, you know, should be supported in doing that.
Thank you. A quick one. Spamanda Zondi from South Africa. I think we should recognize the fact that at the same time as data becomes more available and is growing in number, in volumes and so on, there are also growing theoretical debate that's trying to open up new theoretical. So there's an opportunity for marriage between the two. So suddenly a researcher who's emerging right now have abundance of data, or greater abundance of data than before, but a greater abundance of theoretical conceptual tools to process that data. All that is new. I think it would be nice to recognize that. It would also be nice to recognize that there is growing multidisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity in our discipline, and as you show all of this, but there is growing disciplinarity in the teaching. So there is perhaps it's a law of opposites, I don't know what it is. And very lastly, all of your conversations are very interesting about how it is happening in the science of political science, and a bit of political practice, but limited mainly to government. But there's a whole lot of questions being asked now since the 1980s, actually, about the relationship between political science and activism. How it may actually, I mean, the critical role of political scientists in Tunisia behind the Arab Spring, the political scientists in South Africa in the fall movement. And right now, political scientists are involved in struggles together with young people in Namibia. So there's very interesting things about that interface between political science and political activism. Thank you very much. Stimulating conversations.
Thank you. I think much of what I wanted to say has been captured, because I was getting very worried about the panel in the beginning. That seemed to be suggesting we should go right back to positivism. We started off by saying that most of us are trained in the West. If we've been trained in the West, we've been trained in these methodologies as well. And we come back and make a choice as to whether we're going to follow them or not. So I want to go there. I think most people have answered where we went in. I think that Shadrach's intervention was crucial, because you shifted us to not thinking just about the methodologies we were using, but the ideas that we were contesting as well, and how that has progressed. And so the key questions for me at this moment in time for political science are, what are the key questions for our societies? What are the key ideas that we are pushing forward? How are we teaching, and who are we teaching? And I think some of the debate has to be around that as well.
Just to add something, it has already been said. I'm Josephine Ehile from Makerere University. For this audience, I'm also going to say I'm a member of Codesria,
although the executive secretary doesn't know. So as the presenters were talking about empirical evidence, I was also wondering whether there's a distinction between that and empiricism, and also the fact that at present on the African continent, we are also dealing with issues around particularism, presentism, and the urge to sort of solve quick fix solutions, I must say. And so is there a way in which we can also visualize the fact that grand narratives actually have a utility, as opposed to just focusing on quick fix solutions? And that also talks to the students and how they are engaged in terms of how they deal with the discipline of political science. In our case, in Uganda, I must say that in the current training, somebody has to talk about their district, their sub-county, and the legitimacy to elevate their arguments to make grand narratives is sort of being negated by the same arguments around empiricism and empirical evidence. So I would like a reflection on what exactly we are saying, and in terms of what exactly do we want to say in terms of taking the discipline forward, the discipline of political science on the continent. Thank you very much. I had wanted to ask the categorization about the eclecticism and the way gender comes in. I didn't understand that categorization. I didn't want to critique it before I understand how and why you actually put it there. Thank you.
My name is Diana Højlund Madsen. I'm from the Nordic Africa Institute, and I'm also glad for the turn that the presentations took also with the last presenter, instead of this like one-sided focus on either qualitative and quantitative method. I'm a strong believer in multiple methods that strengthens the research design, but I have some further questions, especially for the last presenter. I would like to know if you have any reflections on how political science can get out of this crisis that you were talking about. I know that's a big question that we can discuss over the days, but if you have any reflections. And then I also thought about all these theoretical and ideas that you were pointing at, different directions or developments over time. Where do you see any transformative potential for political science? I mean, which direction should political science head in, according to you, in terms of all these different theoretical and approaches that you outlined? What holds most potential in, from your perspective? I think that would be interesting to learn more about.
Thank you very much. I think as a participant in the conference, I will take the opportunity to also pose questions and just make some comments before I'll give each of our panelists 3 minutes to respond to whatever they feel like responding to. I think one of the challenges I had with the presentations was the fact that I felt like they were mixing up the goals and methods. Because when you talk about whether research is normative, descriptive, or explanatory, you are talking about the goals. Now, that has nothing to do with the methods that you use, because you can use quantitative methods to achieve normative goals or descriptive goals or explanatory goals. It's the same with quantitative methods. You can use it to achieve all of these. And I felt like we were sort of mixing up the thing where we sort of equated doing quantitative work with being normative or descriptive. I mean, our case work was mentioned, but when I think about colonialism and the dual publics in Africa, his 1975 piece, it's one of the most powerful explanatory frameworks of African politics that I've seen as a scholar, including up to today, in terms of our understanding of state-society relations, social relations, intercommunal relations, and all of that. And it's basically historical work, ethnographic to an extent. So I think we shouldn't mix up the two. The second point I had to make was with regards to the building of these databases and the sort of division of labor in knowledge production that has existed for a while. Because when you take Afrobarometer, VDEM, and all of these databases, they are fabulous. I mean, if you look at the leading journals in political science, a lot of articles are being published out of those databases in APSR, comparative politics, and all of that. Okay, now, how many of those articles are being published by Africans? Now, the next question you need to ask is how many Africans are involved in the building of those databases? Because the problem we've had is that Africa for a long time, you know, I mean, and this goes beyond knowledge production. So the production generally, you know, of value, we've sort of been limited to the most basic stage, which is generating raw materials. And that's what I fear with a lot of these databases, that we are very involved in generating the data, and then there are people who are using this data to publish outstanding pieces in APSR, in comparative politics, in all of this. So in a sense, how does our use or our involvement in the generation of all of this data, how is that helping us to climb up the ladder? Because we are never going to be famous for contributing to the creation of VDEM. We are going to be famous for publishing articles out of those databases, and it's not happening. I mean, I know about some of those databases. I know about people involved in some of the creation of some of those databases, and it's very clear to me that there is this division of labor. And I think it's something that we have to work towards, not challenge, but basically overturning. My final comment was with regards to when I think about the challenges that we have in knowledge production on the continent, higher education, social science, humanities, I think the generation of data is probably not the biggest of our problems. The biggest of our problems is our capacity to pose important questions. We have the problem of research design, okay? So, you know, you go to the village, they are trying to catch the witch that killed someone's child. They have a specific design. They are going to tell you, we are going to put this thing. Everyone should go and drink in it. The person who collapses from drinking it is the one who killed her. So they have a design. When I look at, I mean, I work with Codesia. When I look at many of the proposals, there is no conception of a research design. And so we have a lot of people that have data. They will tell you, I'm using this data, I'm using this data, I'm going to collect this data. And you ask, why are you even collecting that data? Because there is no understanding of what that data can help you do, what it can help you do. And I think that's a really huge problem that we have. And of course, you know, many people have posed the question of theory and concepts. Because we are gathering data. We don't just get up in the morning and go gather data. We are guided by certain theories and concepts already that are prior to the exercise of data collection. And a lot of our graduate training right now is not excellent in introducing graduate students to those concepts and theories. So a lot of the time we are sort of going out almost naked to gather all of this data, not understanding what does it mean why should we use this indicator to measure democratization, to measure political participation? Why should we use this indicator to measure ethnic affiliation? What does it mean? Does it make sense at all? And I think these are fundamental questions that we have to address. I'm not saying that knowing how to gather data and to analyze things, you know, with SPSS and all of that is not important. But a lot of the time we get lost because we don't understand the bigger things that lie behind that. I think I'll give each of our participants 3 minutes, and you can speak of speak on any of the issues that you like to. Maybe we should do the inverse order. So we'll start with Nasungo.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The first question was asked about the trends and the categorization into periods of time. Now, that categorization, from my perspective, is just a question of when those theories were prevalent and they emerged and they were the fashion of the moment. But it does not mean that they actually died within those periods. They were actually, many of them were reformulated. For example, originally the idea that dependency theory, even world systems argue that the only way that global South countries will develop is that they should come together, institute a revolution and end capitalism so that we go socialist. It was revised. And that is when even someone like Samira Amin began talking about the idea that capitalism, that given the fact that different countries are at different levels of development, even within the global South, in Africa specifically, means that there is capacity for autonomous development, even within the framework of global capitalism. And the argument that, in fact, viewing capitalism as bad generally from the dependence perspective, that is wrong, that in fact capitalism has done 1, 2, 3, 4 things that is good for social development and so on. So they were revised and they continue. It is not that they have ended. In any event, even currently, the process of development in Africa generally is informed by this notion of modernization. It has not died. What do we do to bring back theory and philosophy in teaching? I think we have no choice, and this behooves all those who teach political science. And I like the comment that was made by someone behind there about the fact that everybody who is going through political science in school should be exposed to all the different methodological approaches, and whether they choose to follow one or the other should be up to them. But we cannot choose one and not the other in terms of training. Eclecticism and gender. The question for me, what I was talking about, is the fact that at the moment, especially beginning the mid-1990s onwards, when I look at the literature that has been produced, most of it has not been informed by the grand theorizing that was the phenomenon in the 70s and 80s, and that we are approaching each issue from a thematic perspective. So if you look at the studies on ethnic conflict, if you look at studies on gender and empowerment, if you look at studies on civil society and democratization, all those are just thematic without the idea of the grand theorizing that was in place there. That's why I'm calling it eclecticism. Whether I'm right or wrong, perhaps, I don't know. How does political science get out of the current crisis? I think Dr. Murunga at the beginning mentioned one way that this can be addressed, and this is the revival of the African Association of Political Science. Without a professional organization that can actually serve to mobilize people who subscribe to the discipline, it becomes impossible to forge a way forward. Everyone operating individually wherever they are is problematic. If you look at the US, and somebody mentioned earlier, the American Political Science Association is a great force to reckon with, even within the context of policy making. But in our situation, we don't have that one, and therefore it becomes problematic to forge a way forward. And then finally, any transformative potential for political science, what directions and so on, the same kind of thing, that unless we mobilize ourselves and focus on what it is that we should be teaching in school, what is it that we should use in terms of methodologies and so on, we are likely to remain in disarray that has characterized the discipline up to this point in time.
Yeah, we should not be mistaken as advocates of the quantitative approach. We're merely trying to analyze the importance of the use of databases. What I know is what determines the methodological approach you want to use is the subject area you are focusing on. I think that should be the most important thing. So it's what you're studying, what will determine the methodological approach that you're going to use. And I know, like, at many universities, even at my university, we are taught by scholars who are Western-oriented, especially Europe. So they came with this approach in terms of teaching of research methodology and so on and so forth. It's only recent that we're seeing now other scholars are trying to bring in the quantitative aspect in the analysis of political phenomenon. What I've also observed is that there is little interaction in terms of collaboration between departments. Like the economics department in most universities is quantitative. They focus more on econometrics, modeling and things like that. And they haven't interacted much with political scientists and so on and so forth. Even mathematics departments can also collaborate with political science departments and be able to do research that can help the discipline. So, all you know, we're not disciples of the quantitative approach or trying to promote varieties of democracy, which has produced a lot of quantitative data. And from what the chair has said, there have been a lot of publication from those data sets, and there are very few Africans who have published using those data sets, even for Polity, Freedom House, and so on and so forth. I've seen a lot of publications based on Afrobarometer data, but again, over the years, there's been a reduction. I think Africans or African universities should focus on generating our own data and using our own data for publication and teaching. I think that should be our focus. We should move or reduce our reliance on data sets or databases from other sources. Let's try to generate our own data based on our experiences and what we see happening in Africa, the political developments in Africa, and produce articles, books, generate theories, and so on and so forth. We can also try to analyze the curricula in political science. I remember when we were doing curriculum review, and it was surprising that a course on political philosophy had completely omitted topics on African philosophy. So when we teach political philosophy, sometimes we tend to forget completely about African political philosophy. So you see, this has vanished and so on and so on. So I can only comment on those, and maybe others can also say something. Okay.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. Let me just say that the quantification, somebody asked about quantification like in political science like the US. Again, it's not like we are arguing for the same level or for the same usage of data sets. But basically is that if we are talking about decolonization or we are talking about decoloniality of knowledge production in Africa, we should be able to engage with our counterparts, whether in Europe or in the Americas. And that also means that we should be able to use those data sets, publish in high-ranked journals, whether in Africa or outside Africa. And so, if we are going to measure up through the platform of decoloniality, then we need to be at par or even better than our contemporaries elsewhere. So that's basically the idea behind the quantification. If you ask me as an individual, I just wrote a paper. It's being considered by Methods, one of the publications under Codestria. I just wrote a paper, and I call it Political Methodology and Power. How do you, for example, research on power without you having some philosophical foundations and some empirical inquiry about how power influences, whether as power over or power to do or power in whatever sense, without combining the two strands of methodology, which is you have to look at the philosophical underpinnings, because power itself is grounded in philosophy. Again, social sciences as a whole and political science in particular was formerly part of philosophy before it became social sciences. And when it became social sciences, it adopted some techniques, some methodological tools of the social sciences generally. And so there's no running away from combination of the philosophical foundations, of course, the theoretical perspectives, and the methodological tools that has to do with science. Of course, that speaks directly to the science of politics. Because when you say political science, and there's there's nothing about scientific about, there's nothing scientific about it. There's no tools of science you are using. What you are doing basically is political philosophy. It's just political philosophy. And so the scientific part of politics is what makes it political science. And that's the argument about quantification, about the data usage. If you ask me, I prefer to marry the two, which is marry the philosophical foundations of political science with scientific method. And of course, that will give us issues about ontology, which is the claims about the discipline. You talk about the epistemology, and then you talk about the methodology, and then the theory. These are the four processes: methodology, epistemology, methodology, and the theory. It's then you can build up theories, because then you are bringing four key elements of the discipline together. What can we do in Africa and to bring back theory? Again, thank you, Prof, for that question. Again, it speaks to a big issue, not just in terms of quantification, but in terms of theory. Most of African universities, we don't even have solid political theory or political theorists anymore. Not many people want to specialize in political theory. People are always interested in international relations, public administration, public policy, not in political theory. And this is a big issue. If you go to some universities, you don't even have anyone that specializes in political theory. Again, it's a big issue that maybe, as we are here, we could talk about and see how we could revive. And somebody talked about collaborations with other departments. Again, it's like Dr. Mate said, it's not that feasible within the African context. People are too particular about their disciplines. They are not too welcoming, as it were. Everybody just sits in their own space. And of course, somebody talked about the methods and the goals. Again, the two are related. The two are related. If you are using a particular method, then you have certain things in mind. But there's definitely an emerging sub-discipline political science now, which is political methodology. And it's much more nuanced. It's much more sophisticated than just the behavioral revolution or the science of politics. It has three basic dimensions. And so then how can we get political science, how can political science get out of crisis? Again, all discipline, if you ask me, are always in a state of crisis, because it's from there you get new ideas. Political science will continue to remain in crisis because it responds to societal issues, societal problems that is ever present. And so political science, as it responds to one, gets immersed in another one. And so the discipline itself perhaps is born out of crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think our panelists deserve a round of applause. Kaisha did not respond because she completely lost her voice, but we hope she'll recover her voice and and comment on some of these issues, these interesting issues later. There is a coffee break outside. It would be great if we can get here by 12:25 and start off promptly at 12:30. Thank you very much, panelists, for stepping up much earlier than you were supposed to.